Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table, where we discuss issues of the connection between God and culture. And our topic today is cultural engagement on a global scale. And my guest and expert is Dr. Scott Cunningham, who literally trots around the globe working with seminaries and helping them to do what they do in the various contexts in which they function. Scott, I'll let you begin by just telling us a little bit about your background in terms of missionary work and then what you're doing currently.
Good, Darrell. Well, thanks for having me. I don't claim to be an expert in this area, maybe some experience, and I'd be happy to share that with you and those who might be listening. But my missionary career began about 30 years ago in Africa, and we were attached to a seminary there in Nigeria where we had the privilege of shaping the skills and the lives of those who were going to serve the Nigerian church. We were there for 12 years, had a wonderful experience there, 12 wonderful years of working with Nigerian church leaders. For another dozen or so years after that, we worked with an association called ACTI. And ACTI is the Accrediting Council for Theological Education in Africa. That's why we call it ACTI, for short. But that opportunity gave me the privilege of building on the work I'd done in one seminary to work with seminaries across Africa.
Now, how many seminaries were connected, more or less, in Africa?
We had 30 seminaries that were accredited, but probably another 70 or so that we had association with. Mm-hmm. So in various degrees of affiliation with them. And that allowed me the privilege of sort of building into theological education, leadership development across Africa.
Now, for people who have no idea what accreditation is about, why don't you, in as brief and as exciting a way as you can, explain what accreditation is?
Yeah. Some schools, or most people here in the States, would be familiar with accreditation at the university level. For instance, they'd want to be sure that if they're spending time and money investing in their training, they want a school that's accredited. And accreditation in the U.S. means that the Department of Education or some association, a professional association, would accredit a seminary.
Basically say that it's offering education at an appropriate level for the degree that it's offering, and thus gives value to the degree that is conferred.
Yeah, and it's actually accomplishing what it's setting out to accomplish. Mm-hmm. So a school that's saying they're setting out to train those who are going to be pastoring in churches in the U.S., are they actually accomplishing that? So you measure and evaluate, assess the school relative to its mission or purpose.
So not only are we talking about a degree, but we're talking about whether or not they're attaining the objectives of education that they set for themselves in terms of the preparation.
Yeah, exactly. So it's those two ideas, the idea of the mission of the school or the purpose of the school, and the idea of the academic level that's being offered.
Okay, now if I've done the math correctly, and if I'm remembering correctly, you've taken care of 24 of 30 years, so that leaves a remainder.
Yeah, that's right. So, and again, that time of accreditation, that work with schools in Africa was a wonderful experience. Our kids, we had 3 boys. They all grew up in Nigeria during those years and then returned to the States. And there appeared to be a time in our lives, my wife Beth and I, when we were thinking, where's God going to lead us to next? Mm-hmm. And so sort of laid the cards on the table and asked God to direct us. And just about that time, an organization called Overseas Council approached us and asked us to work with them. And we thought, okay, this might be a door that God's opening. Let's pray about this and explore it. And it was actually a wonderful opportunity, and that's the organization that I work with now, Overseas Council, and have been for the past 5 years. The reason that this was such a, to me, intriguing and positive way that God was leading was because I had invested my life in theological education and the training of those who would be serving the church around the world, in Africa specifically. Overseas Council does that around the world. That's their focus, is leadership development. And so they partner with around 80 different seminaries around the world. And as you said, helping them to become more effective, helping them to make sure that their mission, their purpose is appropriate for their context, and then helping them to reach that purpose, to accomplish what they've set out to do in terms of leadership development for the churches that they serve in. Yeah,
my involvement with them goes back to my involvement with Lausanne, and many people who I came in contact with through Lausanne, Cape Town 2010 have been touched by that particular organization and all the work that it's doing in seminaries around the world. Well, that gives us some sense of context. So today you travel literally around the globe helping seminaries assess what it is they're attempting to do. Is that basically what you're doing, taking your accreditation skills, if you will, and applying them to various schools around the world? Yeah,
my skills from being involved directly in one seminary in Nigeria in teaching, administration, and then with accreditation, having a broader look of institutional development capacity in Africa, and then now working with schools around the world. So what I have the privilege of doing is gathering together the leadership teams of these different seminaries, the presidents and deans and board members, and talking about issues of their mission and how to do that more effectively.
Okay, now I imagine there aren't too many people, I can think of one, Manfred Cole, but who have done the kind of global swath that you've done with that kind of an emphasis. So you may have denied having expertise, but you certainly have a lot of experience that is in many ways unique in thinking about what we're going to be talking about, which is cultural engagement on a global level. So as you look at seminaries globally, let's start off with this question. How are seminaries globally, and it's one of these great generic universe questions, but I'll let you go wherever you want with it. How are seminaries in most of the rest of the world like and unlike seminaries here in the West, particularly in the States?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think I'll start with the like part. Seminaries are sort of a unique kind of animal in the sense that what they're doing is they've got one foot in the life of the church, and they have one foot in the life of, you might say, academia, in the life of schools or the university's higher education. And so there's sort of a hybrid kind of institution. So that's the like part. Both of them have those same roots and convictions and purposes. There's that side, which is serving the church, which has the whole reason of existence as being serving the church through leadership development. But on the other side, there's that component of what we're doing in a seminary that realizes that there's that cognitive development, that learning the Word and studying the Word and the traditions of Christianity and how we engage with culture as Christians, to think Christianly, and to do that from an academic framework. And that's where the accreditation part comes in a lot. But the merger, the hybrid of those two fundamental purposes in the seminary is what's common. So whether we're in a seminary like Dallas Seminary here in the U.S., or whether we go to a seminary like South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies, SIACS, in Bangalore, India, you see that similarity, that commonality. So they're institutions that have both a foot in the church and in academia.
But the differences can be, I know that some schools, particularly overseas, because education is so fundamental to some of the cultures, really have a broader goal or scope in terms of what they do. Some of them have become not just seminaries, but almost universities in the way they go about doing what they're doing. Now, does your work spill into those kinds of institutions? And that would certainly be different than most seminaries here.
Yeah, it would be, but let's not let's remember that here in the U.S., for instance, we've got a whole genre of schools that we call liberal arts or Christian liberal arts.
Yeah, exactly.
And schools like Wheaton, for instance, and seminaries that are often connected with those, like Biola and Talbot,
right?
Like at Gordon or Trinity. So they've got that liberal arts component connected to it. Or a Fuller that has branched out into psychology and counseling, as well as world missions and theology. So there's already that impetus that you see in the States. It looks a bit different in the States because of the Christian college movement and liberal arts. And whereas in overseas contexts, we don't have the infrastructure to have a separate university or separate College of Liberal Arts, Christian College of Liberal Arts. And so those are often combined. And so what we see overseas, and this is happening in several places, primarily in Africa and also in some parts in Asia, but primarily in Africa, where there's the impetus to realize, with the realization that there's no opportunities for Christians who want to develop in areas of social engagement, in areas of government, or even in just their chosen field of their career, to get to learn those things from a Christian point of view. And so seminaries now are beginning to offer more and more courses and programs that we might here in the States think of as a Christian liberal arts kind of track.
So let's talk about that a little bit. What kinds of courses would be offered in those kinds of schools and those kinds of contexts that either you might see in a liberal arts situation or you even perhaps might not see in a liberal arts situation because of the nature of the context in which people are operating? Yeah,
I think your last phrase is so important because of the nature of the context in which they're operating. So these schools, as they reflect on their mission and as they're thinking about what's the best way to form Christian leaders for the churches that we serve, they often realize that it's not simply the pastors and evangelists and church planters that are needed by the church, but the church also needs people who are going to be engaged in the society in whatever career, whether they're going to be teachers, whether they're going to be doctors or lawyers, whether they're going to be businessmen. And how then can that school prepare those Christians also to live and think Christianly? And so they are branching into those areas. Now, you asked for specific areas, and that would depend a lot on the context. There are some exciting programs, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as you know, has experienced a tremendous conflict in that eastern part of the Great Lakes region. And led to a lot of poverty, for instance. Well, it could be the other way around. Some of the poverty has led to that conflict. But for whatever purposes, the school, one school in particular, I'm thinking about the school in Bunia, northeast Congo, a wonderful seminary, began, I don't know how many years ago, but it began just offering specific theological, biblical degrees. And then over the past 5 years has developed a range of programs. One of those is in agriculture and community development. You think, yeah, okay.
Yeah, right.
I'm not quite sure.
You haven't offered that at Dallas
yet. That's right. But what's happening is they're simply responding to that contextual need, and with a recognition that these churches that they serve have a desperate need for simply learning how to take care of those basic economic needs, as in agriculture. So they develop a fishery program, an agriculture program there at the seminary. And it's integrated in the sense that they're learning that from a Christian point of view, but obviously it requires other skills on the part of teachers, other programs.
So they're fishers of fish and fishers of men.
They are, exactly. That's the connection. So other schools are doing things in business, in teacher training, in computer science, things of that nature.
So you look at education overseas, and you see this scope of what's being covered. Let me ask you this kind of a question. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time outside the West, but you were educated here, so you understand both systems. What do you see happening overseas that you don't see happening here that you find interesting or intriguing, something that we might learn from in terms of how seminary education is taking place overseas and the way they're engaging is taking place?
Yeah, that's a great question also. I don't think there's so much that's not happening here in the States where you see overseas, but perhaps overseas we're seeing it more in an accelerated or an accentuated way, that we don't see it quite so much here. Mm-hmm. Some of that has to do with simply the economics of what's happening overseas. We don't have overseas in Africa or Asia, Latin America, we don't have the resources that are done here. So here in the States, there can be an institution like Dallas Seminary that has a very strong emphasis on what we would think of as a residential program, although we are now branching out into non-residential programs through distance education. And it's sustainable in that sense. The school is sustainable as an economic force, as in terms of its mission and purpose. That's an effective, viable purpose that we accomplish here. And there's a lot of seminaries like that here in the States. Overseas, what's happening is there are increasing economic pressures to where that traditional what we think of as a residential seminary, where students are leaving their place of work or ministry and coming to study for 2 or 3 or 4 years, that may not be viable for many places overseas. And in fact, I would say most places overseas. And so what we have is a situation in Latin America and in Europe and in Eurasia, the Russian-speaking world, in many parts of Asia, where there are more non-traditional students, more part-time students or distance education students that come into the seminary for 2 weeks at a time, 3 times a year, for instance. Students that are studying in extension sites, students that are studying through distance education. In fact, I can only think of 1 or 2 seminaries, evangelical seminaries in Latin America, where there are more traditional students than non-traditional students.
That's amazing. I taught in India about this time of the year, several years ago, I guess 3 years ago now, and that's what was done, is students would come in for a week or two for 1 or 2 classes. One of them walked all the way from, I don't remember if they were coming from Myanmar or wherever, somewhere next to India, and came a long way, an arduous 36-hour journey to get to the class. He was there for 1 week, and then he goes back and ministers in his context. And so it's a way of doing education so that people can continue to minister and have the impact locally where they are. Isn't that part of the rationale for it?
It is, yeah. So I mentioned the economic side of it, and the other side of it is in terms of effectiveness.
Right.
So it's both of these forces that are being combined so that they're not leaving their ministry. They're not being simply prepared for ministry. They're being prepared in ministry. And so they can come for 2 weeks at a time, for instance. They can do distance education. They can study where they are in extension sites and so forth, while they retain their ministries. And so they're immediately putting into practice those things that they're learning. And of course, they're not being separated from their families, which is often the case when schools, when they have a traditional school setting overseas, they often leave their families. So there are a lot of advantages to that situation. Another obstacle or barrier or disadvantage of the traditional educational setup when it's in the overseas context is that students would often leave their context, oftentimes a rural context. They come into the city where the seminary is. They grow used to that city life. Their children are plugged into schools. Their wife gets a job in the city. It's hard for them to go back into that rural context where they don't have those same amenities.
Right.
And so the traditional school setting actually extracts them from that context, and it's difficult to go back.
We have the same problem oftentimes with international students who come here who get so used to life in the West and what they're used to and what their kids have grown up with that going back is hard. It's the same kind of problem. And
so the solution oftentimes is the same too, and that is, how can we do a better job of educating them, of forming them within their own context without extracting them. So that's another advantage of that sort of distance education. So you began with a larger question, that is, what can we in the West learn from what's happening overseas? I think this is one of the main areas where leadership development has been shaped by the context, by response to the context, in a way that's effective, in a way that's sustainable, in a way that provides greater access to people who need that kind of education, and can now benefit from it without a traditional residential setting. And so all those things in Latin America, I mentioned, in the Russian-speaking world, that would be another place where I can think of maybe just a less than a handful of schools that still have more traditional students than non-traditional students. Asia is moving that way as well, although you still have strong traditional schools in India, for instance, some strong schools in Africa. But gradually, I think we see in seminaries that's the move, that decentralization move is happening. It is happening in the States, and it's accelerating, and that's exciting to see because it is providing that kind of effectiveness and access that traditional schools sometimes don't offer the church at large.
So when you say non-traditional, we're talking primarily about programs in where someone comes into a campus for a short period of time, or are there complete distance learning setups? Because those are two very different kinds of teaching environments.
They are, and we see a multitude. It'd be hard to even enumerate all the different variations on the theme. So that's why I just say non-traditional.
Right.
It's not the typical residential seminary. So, but distance education, where it's being done through internet or through correspondence courses. One of the largest programs in the Middle East is a program that does completely by correspondence. And there, of course, you've got other pressures because you don't really want or can't have an institution in a strongly Muslim area.
I'm getting ready to go there, so just keep going.
Yeah, so that's another reason why those non-traditional programs of theological education are effective and sustainable in those kind of regions.
Because one of the issues that comes up in countries where if you're either from a country that's heavily oriented with religious restriction, I'll say it that way.
Yeah.
Or you're teaching in that context, is the moment you go to the internet, you also make yourself susceptible to being watched.
That's right.
To put it simply. So what are the challenges involved there? That's certainly something we generally don't think about here. If we do, we minimize the risk that's involved because of the freedoms that we possess. So how does that work?
That's right. So again, what we're thinking of is non-traditional systems of leadership development. And in particular, what do you do in areas where, as you said, there are either government restrictions or cultural restrictions on what we'd think of as a traditional setting? You can't have a seminary, as we think of it, in Uzbekistan, for instance, or in Algeria, another place where the gospel actually is growing, where the church is growing, and yet we have to do something different in terms of leadership development. I mentioned the correspondence courses that are happening. Sometimes those don't happen through the internet, but they would happen through the old, what we call theological education by extension, where students are given materials to work through, program materials, program texts, and then they meet together periodically to discuss what they're learning. There's a facilitator there who helps lead them in discussion and understanding what they're learning and applying what they're learning in their own contexts. There are other programs where I can think of one country in Central Asia where students would come 3 times a week, or 3 times a year rather, for 1 week to one place in the country. And it's all very much underground. It's not like, they're ringing the bell or announcing. There's no sign on the door, that says.
No Facebook page.
Yeah, no Facebook page. And all that is taking place in an unseen way. But there are leaders there are facilitators and teachers who themselves have perhaps studied in different areas. In fact, this is a fascinating story, Darrell. This is, think of this country that is a former Soviet Union country, which means that they had Russian as a common language. And so they're able to go from Central Asia to Moscow to study in an evangelical seminary in Moscow, or an evangelical seminary in Moldova. You're saying, what's the common thing here? Well, it's Russian. That those courses are being taught in Russian. They can go there. The visa issue is not a problem for them. They can go there, study, and then come back and train other leaders within their churches in not a seminary context, not a traditional setting, but in house training. So all there is a house, and they're coming 3 times a year to that house for 1 week at a time, using material that is all being translated from usually Russian into their own language, printed, which, by the way, would be illegal, or using a flash drive or something to put that material on so those students can study the Word of God and become more effective in leading those house churches that they're responsible for. That's happening right now.
Wow.
When we think of seminary or leadership development in the U.S., we have one particular box that we usually think of. This is the way leadership development happens. But as you and I know, that's not always the way it happens, and not always the way it can happen best in overseas contexts. So we sort of have to go open out of the box. Think of those non-traditional things that are being developed in countries like in Central Asia and North Africa, where we don't have that luxury, as it were, of a traditional setting.
So this role of these facilitators is important, because one of the complaints that you get when you move from a traditional to a non-traditional model is you lose the modeling. At least that's what's claimed.
That's right.
What's claimed is you don't have the student-faculty relationships. You don't have the one-on-one time that you get with students, although I think it's fair to observe for many of us who teach here that what's happened with residency today is, generally speaking, you don't have students who live on campus, or if they do, they're in and out, they're working, et cetera, so you're not getting as much time with the students as you used to in the past. Yeah. Nonetheless, the complaint is that the non-traditional model can't replace the kind of personal discipleship elements that go in. But it sounds like what's happening in the overseas models is that there are people being placed in locations to play that role alongside the school, oftentimes, or as a part of the school, to make sure that dimension is there. Am I getting that right?
I think that's right. And in a lot of these settings, we think of them as traditional cultures, rather than modern or postmodern, more traditional cultures, in which that face-to-face time, those relationships are so vital. And we could talk about the difference between a more traditional culture and a culture more what we think of here in the U.S. or in the West. But church leaders recognize that they're not going to be able to grow as believers without that constant interaction, that relationship, as you said, the modeling and the mentoring and the discipleship, so that even though you might have Skype, for instance, and see each other over the internet and talk with each other over the internet, there's nothing that compares to those vital relationships that only happen on that one-on-one, face-to-face level. And so I think that they're developing programs where that is a component, even if it's only for several times a year. That there's still that essential component of that face-to-face time that provides that modeling and mentoring. It's certainly hard. It's difficult. Even gathering together as a church to worship every week is difficult in some settings. But that's the desire. That's their ideal, and that's what they're moving. That's the kind of thing they're doing.
Well, let's transition here a little bit, because we've talked a little bit about leadership development, what's going on in seminaries around the world. I want to do that, but I also want to talk about issues that relate directly to cultural engagement. And of course, you live here now, so you understand and grew up here, so you understand life in the West. And again, part of what I'm trying to help people see, and why I wanted to have you in, is to help people see the different ways in which things can happen.
Right.
And obviously, cultural context drives a lot of what does happen. But how is cultural engagement, it's a question like I asked about the seminaries, like and unlike what happens here? Are there similarities? Are there differences? What does that look like?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is going to depend on whether you're thinking of a situation where Christians are the majority or Christians are a minority.
Now, I think that is an extremely important point. So I'm just go ahead and go for it. Yeah.
So in situations where Christians are a majority, or there's a Christian a culture that is heavily influenced by Christian thinking or a Christian heritage, Christian values. And we think of the West primarily as being that. So even though you may not say in Europe, for instance, that you've got a strong Christian majority, there is that Christian heritage, and certainly, of course, in North America. And again, you might dispute whether evangelical Christians, for instance, what their numbers are, the proportion are. But certainly there's that Christian influence within the society. That situation is contrasted with situations, for instance, in India, where the Christian population is small in number. There's a Hindu culture. It's not a strong Christian culture. And the way that the church perceives itself and the way that the church perceives how it engages with the culture around it would be very different, I think. Now, there are going to be some commonalities, and so we can talk about the similarities and the differences. But I think that we have to distinguish areas in which Christianity already has a strong element in the culture versus those where it's not.
And maybe a culture that's kind of in between, I don't know, but still in the same vote like much of the West. It would be a place like Latin America, where you have a strong Catholic and Christian undercurrent that moves through the culture that makes it different than, say, many cultures in Asia or in Africa.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Now, what's the African situation like when it comes to this question in terms of Christian versus non-Christian influence? What goes on there?
Yeah, it's going to be different within each country.
Right.
Again, thinking along those same criteria, but North Africa, which of course is more Muslim, is going to be different than a South African country, for instance, or West Africa, where there's a stronger Christian influence and has been for the past 50 years probably.
So we've kind of mapped out the basic here that it depends on whether, actually this problem is also faced in the West. I was just in Australia this summer talking to them about the abortion issue, which of course is something grappled with all around the world. And in a country where the Christian population influence is about 2%.
That's right.
Very, very small. And it is a post-Christian, very much kind of postmodernist kind of culture, very much in the minority, absolutely next to no chance of having any structural political influence because of the lack of numbers, et cetera. The way in which to approach a social issue like abortion is limited by where they find themselves.
That's right.
So I'm bringing up that example to show that it isn't that the minority-majority issue is almost bigger than the East-West or two-thirds world, majority world, non-majority world contrast.
That's right.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about how cultural engagement is different when you are a significant minority. Let's start there, because I think that's what Christians here sometimes may have a hard time getting their hands around.
Yeah. But let me start first, Darrell, if you don't mind, with that similarity part.
Okay.
Because I think it is important that we understand that Christians everywhere are going to be salt and light.
Right.
That's what we're called to do. We're called to be salt and light within our cultures, no matter where we are. So that's sort of the commonality. That's the biblical injunction that we can take forward. But given that, the question is, how do we do that within our culture? And that's, of course, where the differences are. And I think that my I don't want to say my disappointment, but it might be, to use that word, my disappointment is that sometimes Christians in North America think about cultural engagement in a way that is simply, and they think this is the way that Christians should do it all around the world, but without a recognition that the context is different. And their way of thinking about Christian engagement with the culture is not going to work in India. It's not going to work in Egypt. It's not going to work in Latin America because the context is so radically different. And it may be that the way they're thinking about it in terms of, and oftentimes it has to do with political engagement because of the fact that they have a majority, and within a democratic society, they're able to work through that political process to try to accomplish, as it were, an agenda which they think fits their Christian worldview. That, my friend, is not going to work in India. And so one wonders whether Christians, even within the West, shouldn't be thinking, is this really the best way to engage Christian culture, or engage culture from a Christian point of view? Or are there other ways? Are there other ways we can think of and perhaps learn from in those areas, those cultures that are not dominated by Christian thinking, and yet there are Christians there who are living out their Christian life?
And of course, the reality is I think we're learning as we move from election to election.
That's right.
That the numbers here are not such that you can dictate an agenda.
That's right.
And so the question becomes, how do you function as salt and light in the context in which there is going to be resistance and opposition and challenge to what it is you're going to want to put on the table. And I think that it just so happens that right now I'm working in Matthew 10, which is on mission, and a lot of that chapter of Matthew is dealing with how do you engage in a mission in which there are going to be a lot of people who don't like what you're saying.
That's right.
And there's going to be rejection. There's going to even be hostility. Of course, we see a little bit of that every now and then. And so, how do you deal with those challenges, whether you think you have numbers or not? I actually think that one of the mistakes we make in cultural engagement is to see cultural engagement as being. I'm going to make a contrast here that's going to sound stronger than I intended, but it's the only way to picture it. Do we deal from a position in which we claim to have power, or do we deal from a position in which we claim to serve our society? That's the contrast I want to put out on the table.
And I think that's an excellent contrast. And so what has happened, I think, in the West, and particularly North America, is that through terms such as culture wars, we think in terms of power.
Right.
And we think that in order to win this war, we need to exercise our power within the culture. And within a democracy such as we have here, that often means power at the ballot box. But as you said, that, quote, power continues to diminish within North America. And so the question is this really the best way to frame our thinking about cultural engagement, is to think about culture wars and power? Or are there different ways in which we can think about cultural engagement, ways in which Christians for millennia have been operating in situations out of weakness and a minority position? And that, I think, is something that we might look at in terms of the growing trends within the West. Okay,
so go there. What do those look like? What can we learn from what you see around the world in terms of the way engagement can function? What are the other models or frames around which we can place Christian involvement that also at the same time show the potential and power of what it is that Christians are about in the gospel?
Yeah. Darrell, have you read James Hunter's book, Change the World, to Change the World?
Yes.
Yeah. That's sort of a book that I read about a year ago, and I continue to reflect on, and in a positive way, in the sense that what he's talking about there, and we can summarize that in a minute, but what he's talking about there does seem to describe and provide a conceptual framework for thinking about cultural engagement in settings where, as I've described, Christians are a minority, even a persecuted minority, and don't have the power, the political power, to accomplish their agendas. That framework that he lays out seems to, it resonates with me. And I wonder if that's not, if you would ask me where would I go in terms of cultural engagement, some of the ways that he's framed that discussion might be helpful.
Like?
What Hunter says, if I can describe him or summarize him accurately, is that some of the things I've been saying about trying to accomplish a Christian agenda through the political process or through power structures may not be our primary objective. It may come about just as we live our Christian lives, but that would be a secondary outcome rather than a primary objective. And that's an important distinction to make. Okay.
And the other thing that it seems to me is in play here is thinking through how do Christians be Christians and serve well. I mean, if I can think about, when I look at the biblical exhortations of, say, an epistle like 1 Peter, where it's talking about life as a Christian in the context in which obviously Christians were a terrific minority in the first century. Basically, his exhortation is be a good citizen.
Absolutely.
Live well with those around you. Serve faithfully. Engage ethically. It's just basically looking to see where you can be a positive influence on that which is going on around you and contribute in such a way that people see the value of who you are as a human being, and maybe, to use the words of Matthew, might see your good works and glorify the Father in heaven. So is that the kind of direction that we're talking about, and that the kind of emphasis that we're seeing?
I think it is, yeah. And that quote, by the way, that they might see your good works and glorify God who is in heaven. In 1 Peter, actually, you have a very similar situation that they might see your good works and glorify God on the day that He visits us.
That's right.
So the same idea is there. The other passage I think of is 1 Timothy chapter 2, when Paul exhorts. He begins with the pray for all people,
right,
and especially kings and those in authority. This is why, because this pleases God, who desires all men to come to a knowledge of the truth. For there's one God and one mediator, Jesus Christ, who himself is human. And then Paul says, for this very reason, I was made a herald, an apostle, one who proclaims the gospel to the nations. And so what Paul does there is he looks at that exclusivity of what God has done in Christ and says, because of that, we have an inclusive mission to pray and to proclaim. And match that together with what you're saying in 1 Peter, to live out our lives in a way that they might see our good works and glorify God. That it begins at that personal level of discipleship of what we're doing in our family life and what we're doing in our congregational life. That's where it begins. So how do we live out our lives in a way that people will see that light in the midst of darkness?
Now, what's interesting is we did a podcast recently with Andy Crouch talking about culture making, and this was his emphasis too, that really we tend to go global and political when perhaps we ought to think more local about our influence and how we can influence the things that we're more directly in many ways involved with. And it's a similar kind of emphasis in some ways. So how does, again, learning from what you see globally, when you look at what's going on globally, are there models of that kind of engagement that you see that you can share with us that might be helpful in helping people kind of flesh out what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that is the what we see happening in those kind of contexts, where Christians are being faithful to what God has called them to be. And if God has called them to be a businessman, then they're being faithful within that context. If God has called them to be a teacher, they're being faithful before their students. And faithful, I think, means several things. It means living out the Christian life in a way that's open for other people to see. and also to be competent in what you're doing. Whatever you do it for the glory of God. So they're doing it well. They're not being sloppy, being lazy. They're being diligent. They're competent, and with that focus in mind, this is part of being a testimony to Christ within the area that they're called. If they are called to civil service, if they all are called to government or to a life in military, they live out their Christian experience within those contexts. And that, I think, is a way that it happens in every culture. It can happen in every culture. And without thinking of we have to take over this political structure, or we have to change this particular way of power engagement.
So, just as an example, if I think of the person who, say, is I'll give a hard example. I know this happens in the Middle East. You've got a Christian who's either in politics or in the army.
Yep.
Obviously, the country's concerns are not being driven by the church.
Right.
How does a person function in that context? When you were talking about this kind of a model, what are they doing? What are they looking at? How are they thinking about it?
It's a hard question. Maybe I need to step into their shoes and really deal with the issues at hand. And I think sometimes there may be tremendous conflicts between what they see as their Christian values, and yet in those situations around them, there are values that are very contrary to what's happening. I can think of several testimonies I've heard of, for instance, a Chinese Christian who there was influence on him to cover up certain kinds of corruption, certain kinds of things that were happening within the manufacturing plant that was in China. But as a believer, he said he couldn't do that, he wanted to be above that. And because of that, he lost his job. But he maintained his Christian testimony. Later on, of course, God used that in the lives of other people so that other people came to know Christ through that example. So in those kind of contexts, that's not going to be an easy thing, because a lot of times those values around you are in conflict. Yeah. Whereas here in the West, we may feel comfortable because the choices we make to live out a Christian life may not meet that same kind of resistance. Whereas in the situations you're talking about, in the Middle East, for instance, when a soldier is in military or somebody who's in government, may find that there's more and more conflict, but yet to retain that Christian witness becomes such an important part of what it is to be a Christian.
So how are the schools? You said there are some courses that deal with helping civil servants and that kind of thing. What kinds of courses are those, and what are they doing? How are they helping their students face what they're going to face?
Yeah. Think of schools in Singapore, for instance. Seminaries there. The traditional seminary, of course, that has for many years focused on pastors, on teachers, and so forth. But then began to see openings within the broader church context of businessmen who also wanted to learn about scriptures and wanted to learn about how to live their Christian life within a business context, within the business world. And the point here is there's integration. That is, our Christian life is not segmented into what we do on Sunday, what we do in our family, what we do in our church, and then there's also what we do in our business, but that's different than what we're doing on Sunday mornings. So how do we actually bring integration within that? And I think that's the kind of course that these seminaries are offering. So they're approaching these businessmen in Singapore. They're meeting over the lunch hour, and talking about their experience as Christian businessmen, and dealing with some very important issues that are about how to live out that Christian life. What does it mean ethically to overcome those tendencies toward corruption, for instance, that you might find? What does it mean to give your employees a fair wage and fair benefits, and to live Christianly in that way? What does it mean to use the resources that God has given you through the profits, for instance, of your company, and use those for the glory of God by investing them in the church, investing them in missions, and investing them in centers where more leaders can be trained? Those are the kind of things that are being discussed, and I think that there's a real hunger for that among Christians in those countries that haven't seen an integration of their Christian life, their Christian worldview, with what they do 40 hours a week.
So we get these emphasis on integration, and we get the emphasis on service and thinking through that. And we've talked a little bit about the challenges of what happens in a situation where you're a minority. Let's flip it again and talk about now where places where the Christian presence is broader, it's more pervasive, but you still have this tension that the world and the way in which it operates oftentimes isn't quite exactly the way Christians would see things, and the tensions that you have. What advice? You've said that there's a consistency across all this in terms of how to think about it, but the situation that we do have here is a little bit different. You're not 2%. There is the opportunity to engage. There's the freedom and the right to engage. In some of the countries where we've talked about, you don't have those freedoms and those rights. So how do you see what you've seen and learned overseas applying to the situation in which there might be the opportunity to have meaningful conversations across the whole swath of life? Does it change very much, or are the values pretty much the same? What differences make a difference, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question specifically, Darrell, and if I don't, bring me back.
Okay.
But I'm thinking about a situation in India, for instance, where, as you know, corruption is a huge issue. And this is something that the church believes it can speak into the culture in a way that the culture might understand and value the Christian voice in this particular discussion.
So there's a contribution. I'm going to use a phrase that we see in the West a lot in a lot of these discussions. There's a contribution to the common good of the well-being of the society that the church is trying to step into, and that's how they're approaching the question.
That's right. That's right, exactly. And so they would hold conferences, for instance, on issues of corruption, where they're able to gather together business leaders, non-Christian, often business leaders, those in the military, those in government, to talk about issues of corruption. And the reason that they're able to bring them together is because all of the culture is concerned about this. They're concerned when there's a building that they build for the Commonwealth Games that collapses and people die. They're wondering, okay, now did the contractor take a shortcut on this? This is not right. They're concerned when there's huge black holes in the government where money just disappears. They don't want that. And so they're able to gather them together and then provide a Christian voice into this topic, and that, I think, is something that Christians all over the world are seeing as possibilities, where Christians have positive things to say, to speak into the culture from their own values and vantage point, from a Christian framework, that the culture around them will say, well, that's something that we would also agree with, that we would value. We value those things, and that's a positive contribution that can be made.
Now, the harder situation, of course, is when the value that the Christian has is not necessarily in line with where the culture is going. And we
That's right.
have seen that obviously illustrated in a whole variety of areas in our context today. But that doesn't change the calling in some sense. It may change the dynamics of the calling. But again, the tension that I see here, let me see if I can make this a clearer question. The tension that I see here is, what do you do when the values in the conversation are mixed? Mm-hmm. One of the things that's often said today is that when it comes to monetary issues and business issues and materialism issues and that kind of thing in the West, that oftentimes you get a sense that a Christian is defending a certain kind of economic model as opposed to whether or not that economic model actually works in delivering to people all that we might hope a society would deliver to people. I'm trying to do this as non-politically as possible, and may be hard to do. And my sense is that sometimes Christians are accused of having values that line up more with a political ideology or an economic ideology than they do necessarily with Christian values. And so I'll go ahead and say it, medical care, which of course is a huge debated area because of what it means for entitlements and the cost of it, et cetera. But on the one hand, you sit there and say, who doesn't want to create a society in which people can get basic medical care and whether they can afford it or not, that human beings are taken care of? Right. So you have this tension between what economically might be viable and the human value of reaching out to a person in need and extending compassion to them and being sure that they're cared for. How do you wrestle through those tensions? And does what you have seen overseas help us with that? And the reason I ask that question is because in my own experience, which has mostly involved Europe, the battles that we get into on an area, say, like medical care, most Europeans have trouble identifying with because they assume that the human value, even they'll even use Christian value, is to make sure that people are cared for. What do you see in that kind of area where like I say, the values are mixed and you're prioritizing a mixture of values?
I'm trying to think of another situation besides medical care in the U.S., for instance. Can you think of a particular issue in a different context, in a non-Western context where that might be an issue? I know there are those things. I'm just trying to get a handle on.
Think of what it might be. Yeah. I think that one of the examples that you gave that shows at least the intent are these agricultural and fishery programs in which you're actually trying to help people move to care for themselves, but where the initial extended hand, if I can say it that way, the initial extended hand is to make sure they're being cared for. Does that make sense? And so you're trying to accomplish multiple objectives at the same time. I see, and to have, and to teach, it's interesting to teach pastors to have those kinds of skills is a kind of integration to put together what you've talked about that normally in our thinking we would distinguish, we would segregate from one another. And so I see the driving of a value, and this goes back to the model. I see the driving of a value to serve and to step into the situation in a way that makes clear what the effort to meet human needs are in a healthy way, determining and prioritizing what goes around it, if I can say it that way. And those efforts to foster development and to step in and bring a situation in which development can happen seems to me to have those priorities right.
Yeah, I think I get the drift of what you're where you're going on this. I think part of it is an awareness on the part of the church as to what the priority issues are. I think that many of our churches unfortunately have blinders in terms of the main cultural issues that are going around them. And they tend to either be simply those, and I don't mean to be pejorative here, but it seems just from my sense that they tend to, whatever issues are around there's a sense of either denial that those issues are going on, but they're not important to us, or they're just making those up, or there's a sense that whatever we see in the world, the church is contrary to those, and so there's a sense of no. We're the party of no,
and we're not going to partner with anybody in anything that involves a global effort, because obviously the global effort's wrong.
That's right.
Okay,
that's right. And so part of it is a matter of awareness. Can we actually open our eyes and see broader than the four walls of our church, of our congregation, to see what's actually happening in the world around us? And so, for instance, you would have, let me take a few examples here. A seminary in Manila that offers programs, typical programs for their pastors, trained pastors and teachers and so forth. But you ask them, well, a lot of Manila lives in poverty. How are you preparing your pastors to deal with issues of poverty that they're going to find in their contexts? That's something that we really haven't thought about. Now, I'm not saying there is a particular seminary in Manila like that. I think most of them have begun to deal with those issues. But here's an issue that the culture around them is screaming. This is a huge issue for us. What does the church have to say in a positive way that can contribute toward helping us deal with this issue of poverty?
I've got two examples in my own life leap immediately to mind. When I was doing spiritual formation work with our spiritual groups, I would purposely take our students just a couple of blocks across the street. And this is at a time when Dallas was made up slightly differently, although there's still some of this now. But the seminary in the 80s and 90s was located in the midst of what most people would say were some of the worst environment in Dallas. But there were all kinds of women's shelters and outreach things. Right. And the point that I would take them there and show them these agencies and say, here are agencies in our context that are trying to help people who are in terrific need. And we would simply go and say, an hour a week, every other week, how can we help you? And my point was to say, you don't need to create a Christian organization to do this. There are organizations right here doing this into which you can step and volunteer and be of service. That's one example. The second example I think of is in Guatemala. It's Seteca. Seteca is located literally blocks from the garbage dump that literally you can watch. If you go, I go every 2 years up until recently, and you can literally watch the garbage dump move across this ravine and cover it. But there were kids living in that garbage dump, and there was a program, and I don't remember who I think it was World Vision, ran an orphanage school in the garbage. It literally was located on the edge of the garbage dump, and seminary students from Seteca were going and were part of the volunteer workforce that stepped into that place, and they were helping there. Right. And so it was your example of what are you doing to help with the poverty. There also were courses and circumstances in which they were teaching their students how to minister in contexts where there weren't many resources, that kind of thing. And in fact, one of the things that we did with that group was, in fact, the reason I was there is we taught a class in which we took North American students from Dallas and from Denver. The person that I taught it with teaches Old Testament at Denver, Danny Carroll, and he still does this. And he would take a swath of students down, and we'd mix them with the Latin American students. The class would be bilingual, some in Spanish, some in English. And the one assignment that the American students had was this: talk about how you would read the Bible differently if you lived here versus where you live in North America.
That's right.
And of course, they were only there 2 weeks, but what immediately became clear from what we showed them and where the seminary was located and the garbage dump being called. And we took them into the garbage dump so they could see what life was like for someone living in that context. What immediately became clear to them is that all these theoretical passages on poverty weren't so theoretical anymore. Right. It was in their face.
That's right.
And that produced an awareness and a sensitivity. Virtually everyone we took on that trip would come back and say, I'm not the same person, and I'm not reading the Bible in entirely the same way. Not in a negative sense, very much in a positive sense of, I am sensitive to things now I was never sensitive to before I made the trip.
Yeah. I think that's a great example of awareness. When I think of these issues, I think usually of three words, and I think I've probably mentioned them throughout this conversation already, but if I just highlight them. The first one is awareness. The second one is intentionality. We need to be intentional about actually providing those kinds of experiences or that kind of teaching, that kind of information.
And moving in direction of those kinds of services.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So intentionality. And the third one would be, and now I've forgotten what, no, the third one is integration. So that they see that when we're talking about the text and the context, the word and the world, the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, as Karl Barth would say, the double listening, as John Stott would say. We listen to the word and we listen to the world. Not in the same way, of course,
right?
But we still are open to hear those voices. And how do we integrate that within our training as we train those who would lead congregations? And then how, of course, are they going to be leading their congregations in a way that has those three components as well?
And when I think about awareness, what I also think about is the impact of if I can say it, a mentality. There's a mentality that the awareness. We're not aware in some cases because we have blinders. We're also not aware sometimes because we're not willing to think about how might I approach this differently than I have in the past, or what ought I to be sensitive to that perhaps I haven't been sensitive to in the past, that kind of thing. And one of the reasons for having this particular conversation on cultural engagement and getting a global perspective on things and asking the questions the way that I have is because I'm trying to picture for people who may never have traveled outside the United States or that kind of thing, how life in a different world, in a different context, does create different sensitivities and different awarenesses. And out of those different awarenesses, there are sensitivities that are created that make you think differently. But we're talking about a biblically different kind of thinking. We're not talking about just different thinking. It's not something to be afraid of. It's something to actually reflect upon and embrace.
It is. And we think of how we read the text also as we read scriptures. As you said, people having experienced that would read the text differently. And you, of course, would be familiar from Luke 10 of the prodigal son. And it's an interesting experiment, Darrell, if you would do this. You ask people here in the West to retell that well-known story of the prodigal son. And then you go outside the U.S. and you tell them to retell the story of the prodigal son. See, one important difference is that people in the U.S. hardly ever mention the drought that took place, whereas people overseas will always mention the drought.
Right.
And that's because that's in their awareness.
They live with it. They're so connected to the ground that if things go bad, they understand how actually bad it can get. And so they read Luke 15 and they're sitting there and they hit that part and they go, we understand how a person could be driven to reconsider the way they're living their life and seeing what's going on because we know what desperate condition that puts us in when we're totally dependent on what the ground produces.
Yeah. So there is that reading of the text that is impacted by their context as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming in and discussing these issues with us. Our hope is that this has been helpful to you in thinking about cultural engagement kind of by looking at it from the outside in. That's kind of what we've tried to do, and to think about the principles that are involved and the different factors that are involved, and perhaps that's made you pause and think, as it should, all of us, about how to culturally engage in our own context as a result. So, Scott, I appreciate you coming in and doing this. We thank you for joining us at the table, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
for listening to the Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.